My name is Victor Veith. I am Chief Program Officer for Education Research at the Zero Abuse Project. And the subject at hand today is how do we recognize, how do we respond to the spiritual impact of child abuse or neglect? To that end, toward that goal, we'll chat about what does the research say about the spiritual impact of child abuse or neglect? What does the research tell us about spirituality as a source of resilience? And most importantly, how do we apply this research? What is trauma-informed spiritual care look like? What is the utility of a chaplain at a children's advocacy center? And we'll also chat about the importance of reform on this topic at the seminary level. There's a large and growing body of research on this issue. This literature review was published by the American Psychological Association in 2009. At that time, there were 34 major studies involving more than 19,000 abused children, and most of the studies found that children are spiritually impacted as a result of trauma. The studies illustrated 527 victims of abuse. Some were physically violated, some were sexually abused, some were emotionally abused, many all of the above, because we know from adverse childhood experience or ACE research and polyvictimization research that most children who are abused in one way are typically abused in multiple ways. Every child, every single child in the study was spiritually impacted as a result of abuse. And that manifested itself in feelings of guilt, anger, grief, despair, doubt, afraid of dying, a belief that God is unfair. What does this mean? Some years ago, I was part of a team investigating physical and sexual abuse at a Christian boarding school, and I saw the research come to life before me. I interviewed a man who said, Victor, do you think that God understands ACE research? And I said, tell me about this. And he said, well, I understand it. I was beaten on this compound. I was raped on the compound. All my friends were beaten or raped on this compound. One of my friends killed himself as a result of the maltreatment. So I get it. He says, I got an A score through the stratosphere. And that no doubt explains why, as a young man, I became addicted to drugs or alcohol. It explains why, as a young man, I loved to go into a bar on Friday night and pick a fight with the biggest fellow in the bar because it just felt so good to hit somebody. But the very worst thing I ever did in my life, he said, is I killed somebody. I was high on drugs and I crossed the divider line on the highway. I accidentally took somebody's life. So they sent me to prison for criminal vehicular homicide. Well, I'm out of prison now. I got a pretty good job, but I am terrified of dying because if I die tonight, how does God sort out my life? Do I get a pass? Does God say, yeah, you did some really bad things, including killing somebody, but you had a pretty rotten childhood, so you get a pass. You get to go on into paradise. Or does God hold me responsible for my many and great sins? That is a spiritual injury. And although a victim may have a spiritual injury and as a result they're angry at God and they want nothing to do with organized religion, many still say that they pray frequently and they often report having a spiritual experience. Another person in that case said, I ain't going to do it, Victor, never going to go back to church. But every morning I get up really early and before I go to the office, I read the Bible for an hour. And I said, tell me about that. Why do you do that? And he said, I don't know. I guess after all these years, I'm still searching for something. And if we can aid a victim in that search, that quest for the divine, a large body of research says it may be a strong source of resiliency, a buffer against the trauma. The study, for example, found that a victim's spiritual coping behavior could play either a positive or a negative role in their coping with the trauma. Victims of severe abuse, very young victims, often get stuck in their spiritual development. Nonetheless, those victims who report a greater resolution to their childhood abuse are the ones most actively able to turn to their spirituality to cope instead of simply going it alone. Other research has found similar results. Religious and spiritual forms of coping contribute to decreased symptoms. Religiousness can moderate PTSD or other indicators of trauma. And in a study of nearly 3,000 women victimized as sexual assault survivors, those who maintained a healthy sense of spirituality did better in the short and long term. The study from Johns Hopkins found that even without meaningful medical and mental health intervention, those victims who maintained a healthy sense of spirituality, it was a buffer against the trauma. This study from Jarrell's in 2019 found that a healthy sense of spirituality may be the most important source of resilience among sexually abused children. And the study from Gower in 2020 reached similar conclusions. Well, with research that large and growing, we need to pay attention to it. But how on earth do we do it? How on earth do we address the spiritual needs of survivors of abuse? In part, we have to pay attention to the victims' outcries. The study published in 2017 found that in children's advocacy centers across the country, victims of abuse often raise spiritual or religious questions. Questions such as, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? Or questions such as, I pray and I pray and I pray and I ask God to stop the abuse, but the abuse kept happening. So, what does that say about God or me or both? This study found that many children's advocacy centers were recognizing these spiritual injuries and realizing how important they were to the victims. And so, ad hoc, they might reach out to a pastor or a priest or a rabbi or imam, somebody connected to the child's faith tradition. And sometimes that worked out pretty well, sometimes not so much. And so the researchers said, we just got to get a better handle on this. We have to dramatically improve the knowledge of child protection professionals in responding to this issue, but we also have to better educate the faith leaders. And then we got to get them in the same room and teach them how to work together for the betterment of a child. That was music to our ears because for some time we have been trying to do just that. We had a program, we used to call it Chaplains for Children. We now call it Keeping Faith, where we do put faith and child protection leaders in the classroom together. We teach them all of this research and then we give them vignettes. Okay, if this case is arising in your community, how do you coordinate medical and mental health and spiritual care? Well, when we're properly educated, what does trauma informed spiritual care look like? Well, we certainly need a mental health provider who is fluent in the research. The American Psychological Association has published not one, but two treatises for mental health providers. And the APA says go ahead, use cognitive, behavioral, and other evidence based approaches. But within that framework, you can still explore the spiritual impact of the trauma. And this article says there's plenty of room for the faith and mental health provider to collaborate. Sometimes the clergy person needs to be a consultant to the mental health provider. I consulted on a case where a woman was in her 40s. She is in counseling. She says to her therapist, there is no hope for me. I am doomed to go to hell. And the therapist says, tell me about that. Why do you believe that? She grew up in a very conservative Lutheran community, and in that community, you don't take communion till you're 13 and you're properly educated. And the reason for that is there's a Bible verse suggesting that if you don't discern the body and blood of Christ, you may unwittingly drink and eat to your judgment. And so, growing up in that community, her perpetrator took advantage of that construct and said, hey, when you start to take communion, I won't sexually touch you anymore. And so the little girl hung on with all her might. And then, when she's 13 and confirmed on the eve of her first communion, her dad comes in and rapes her all over again. And when the rape is done, she says, Father, this is the last time, right? Because tomorrow I take communion, and you always promised it would stop then. And her dad gives her an evil laugh and says, honey, there ain't no God. I just said that to you because I knew you believed it. I thought that would keep you quiet. This will end when I no longer desire you. Consistent with the spiritual injury research, she is now filled with rage. And the next morning, when she takes her first communion, she purposely spits into the communion cup. When she's chewing the wafer in her mind, she says, I hate you, Jesus. I am chewing you up right now. In an hour, I'm going to poop you into the toilet and flush you the blank out of my life. Now, fast forward, she's in her 40s. She's terrified of what she did that day. Long story short, we connected her with a trauma informed Lutheran clergy person who said, let's talk about a story today. Let's look at the story of the crucifixion of Christ. What do you see here? Well, I see that soldiers are spitting on the Lord. Soldiers are torturing Jesus to death. And from the cross, what is Jesus saying to the soldiers? He is saying, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Gosh, if Jesus could forgive the soldiers for torturing his body to death, do you think Jesus could forgive you for spitting in the communion cup? Gosh, I never really thought of it that way. Maybe he could. That is trauma informed spiritual care. The answer to bad theology is good theology in coordination with the mental health provider. Sometimes that therapist needs to be a consultant to the clergy person who may have very little education on cutting behaviors or eating disorders or suicidal ideations. They both need to have a good Rolodex of consultants when they need that assistance. And they both need to be able to make appropriate referrals. They need to collaborate at least at a limited basis and perhaps even a full collaboration where the victim signs releases and the medical and mental health and a spiritual worker are all coordinating their response to the needs of the victim. And I think we're at a point in history where we need to have chaplains in our Children's Advocacy Center who are able to address the spiritual needs of victims who want that service. We have chaplains in hospitals, we have chaplains in the military, we have chaplains in other professions where they are exposed to a lot of trauma. How is it that we are so far behind the curve on having chaplains in our Children's Advocacy Center? Well, some years ago, we worked with the CAC in Greenville. They had a trauma informed chaplain who used to work at a hospital. She then went through our chaplaincy training and became the first CAC chaplain in the United States. Here she is, Reverend Carrie Nettles, obviously the one with the collar. I'm in between. And the other woman is Shauna Galloway Williams, the executive director at that CAC. And they've had this program up and running for several years. Last year, over 500 families, adults, and child victims asked for the services of the chaplain. And then the chaplain also takes a leadership role in educating all the other faith leaders in the community. So if the chaplain has to make a referral, let's say the victim is Catholic, we wouldn't refer the victim to any old priest. We would look for a priest who is trauma informed. That reform is now spread to 5 children's advocacy centers and counting. This is very consistent with the cultural competency standard that every CAC must meet in order to be accredited. We do need to take into account the worldviews of our victims. I co-authored this article, this law review article, setting forth the value of chaplains at children's advocacy centers and how that work may function. It's an open access article. You can download it at your leisure. I also wrote this law review article summarizing the research on the spiritual impact of trauma and connecting it with numerous anecdotes of how medical and mental health and other professionals can collaborate with faith leaders to have a holistic approach. We also need to dramatically improve education on this topic at seminaries. This study by Betts of every accredited seminary in the United States found that no more than 3% of them were providing any education on this particular topic. We need to change that. And if we can get seminaries more engaged, we will have more theological writings that can be of assistance. I co-edited this special seminary journal on addressing this issue. This was my thesis from seminary. What did Jesus say about child abuse? And I'm convinced that if we can engage faith communities theologically, they will come along at a very high level in addressing the needs of victims. Case in point, the Southern Baptist Convention cited my thesis and said, yeah, let's rise to this level, a theological challenge. Let's respond to the message of Jesus to care for children at all costs. And I'm convinced you could do this with every faith tradition. This book, cut and paste every reference to children in the world's most prominent religions. Whatever faith tradition you're looking at, there's a lot of theological hooks that you can hang your hat on. And there's early research from Pepperdine saying if we engage a community theologically, we can make a difference. And we are partnering with these researchers on our Chaps for Children or Keeping Faith program, as well as a seminary course that we have developed and are teaching, as well as some of our other work in this area. So look for more research to come. I love this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, although some scholars say he may not have said it. Certainly a paraphrase of what he wrote in his book, Ethics. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to act is to act. There's nothing more compelling than an idea whose time has come, and it is time for all of us to get on the same page and to coordinate medical and mental health and spiritual care for victims. I would submit that God expects nothing less of us.
Hello, everyone. Today I want to tell you a story about the overlooked victims in ISIS's regime of genocide, told to me by young voices across IDP camps of the Middle East. See, it's a story of the children of religious minority communities. It's a story of young Yazidi girls in Iraq older than the age of 5 whose lives changed in the blink of an eye as ISIS fighters stormed their villages with the clear intent of erasing them not only from the earth, but from memory. It's a story of young Christian and Druze girls in Syria trying to escape before ISIS captured and forced them into sexual slavery. They were from different regions, from different parents, from different villages, from different countries. These children, though, they shared a common, horrific story of pain and trauma at the hands of perpetrator groups like ISIS, being targeted solely because they are members of ancient minority religious communities and were girls. Since 2014, a key weapon in ISIS's genocidal mission against Yazidi, Christian, and other religious minority communities was the targeting of these young girls, a means of destroying their families, and by extension, their communities. See, ISIS deemed such girls over the age of 5 would be sold into sexual slavery. From the Yazidi villages in Mount Sinjar to Christian villages in Nineveh to Druze villages in Sweda to Shiite Turkmen villages in Tel Afar, these girls witnessed ISIS massacre their brothers, their fathers and mothers, their uncles and aunts, their grandfathers and grandmothers, before turning to them. Girls usually no older than 16 years old were rounded up and enslaved by ISIS fighters. And while 2,000 Yazidi children have escaped, the girls' returns were far from a happy ending as they face the bitterly harsh stigmas surrounding sexual violence by their families, by their communities. They faced rejection and abuse, making them vulnerable, making them feel like they had to leave. Many of these girls were ostracized to such a degree that many felt forced to never return. They were seen as impure and having brought misfortune to their home. Some even report being perceived as collaborators with their attackers. And for those allowed to return to their family homes, prevailing stigmas forced many to remain silent about their experience. And that led to emotional and psychological tolls, in addition to the lack of proper medical and justice support. See, these girls, though, are not the only ones overlooked. The children born of rape between ISIS and the captors, they face severe stigmas and are rejected by their mothers' families and communities. Why? Because in the name of fear, trauma, and tradition. See, it's estimated that 80% of the Yazidi women rescued from ISIS have had children fathered by their captors. Mothers are forced to make impossible choices between keeping their innocent child or reuniting with their families and community. As a result, orphanages across Syria and Iraq have been flooded with children born to ISIS fighters and girls of their victim communities. The children, they're denied basic human rights, and they're going to grow up continuing to be rejected by society unless something happens. I've had the privilege since 2015 to go and meet with these girls. They're resilient, they're brave. They escaped ISIS captivity and the harmful stigmas, and they overcome with their voice. I'm in awe of their strength, shattering the silence surrounding sexual violence, as they refuse to be silenced regardless of the stigma. These women have spoken out to save each other, to save their community and their people by sharing the story and asking, where are you, world? Together we must answer the call. We can accomplish this by encouraging religious leaders to use their platforms to speak directly on the issues. And I'm pleased to tell you this process has already begun with the launch of the Declaration of Humanity of Leaders of Faith and Leaders of Belief that was launched November 2020 by the UK government, which I am grateful to be a part of. See, we were honored but aware of the weighty responsibility, and we proposed the declaration, a declaration that condemns conflict-related sexual violence. It redefines the understanding of rape and sexual violence and affirms the innocence of children and children born of rape and the need to fully honor and accept them. The declaration is a first of its kind, and it calls for multiple faiths and beliefs to unite in a common front to challenge damaging norms and encourage support for survivors internationally. It puts action to words and commits signatories to doing everything in our power to both prevent conflict-related sexual violence and also support survivors and children born of rape. I'm pleased to tell you this declaration has been signed by many faith leaders worldwide, and you too can commit to the values and action plans set forth in the declaration as a signatory, acknowledging the innocence of survivors and victims and emphasizing the necessity of integrating them back into their community, including in the religious community. It's the strongest weapon. This is the strongest weapon against ISIS's campaign of mass wartime rape. And that process of support and acceptance of these survivors, it begins with us as religious leaders. We have already seen the power of local religious authorities as the best advocates for survivors. In the case of the Yazidi community, for example, in northern Iraq, where the Yazidi spiritual leader known as Baba Sheikh issued an edict telling families accept and reintegrate survivors, especially those who escaped from captivity when they were forced to convert to Islam. Now, before, it was an previously unpardonable sin in the Yazidi religion. Women and girls were no longer shunned because of that edict, but rather they were welcomed back. The edict signaled to the Yazidi community to abandon the tradition of honor killings and discriminatory acts perpetrated against survivors due to the social stigmas. Baba Sheikh went on to further welcome children born of Yazidi mothers and ISIS captors. However, unfortunately, just 3 days later, the Supreme Spiritual Council of the Yazidi faith reversed its decision due to prevalent stigma held by members of the community. Stigma makes an impact on decisions. And this signaled the need for all of us to support the actions exemplified like Baba Sheikh's first edict against survivors and their children born of rape. That stigma can hurt them, but people like Baba Sheikh and other religious leaders can stand and support them. I see hope in the smiles and laughs of survivors who've been brave in sharing their stories. And in the words of my friend and hero Ikhlas Khudar Bajou, a Yazidi survivor and activist, she says, "Why am I smiling? I smile because it's our smile and our humanity that is our strongest weapon."
This symposium on strategies for preventing and healing child sexual abuse addresses a critical topic for faith and for flourishing. It is critical because such abuse ought not to happen. It is critical because those who have been abused need healing. It is critical because we need to find the best strategies for prevention in the future. It is also a critical topic because it drives people away from their faith communities. It can, of course, understandably drive away the victims, their family members, and loved ones, and it can drive away and alienate others in the community as well. Such abuse can thereby impede the important work that these religious communities do in promoting flourishing, both here and now, and also in aiming at more transcendent ends. In addition to preventing abuses in the future and healing for those who have suffered, these issues need to be addressed also so as not to hinder religious communities from carrying out their important work. And it is this that I would like to speak to you about today, and about which much of my own research is concerned: the role of religious communities in promoting human flourishing. In this talk, I will describe the research in greater detail. I will further explore why participation in community seems so powerfully to affect health and well-being. And I will conclude with a return to these questions of childhood sexual abuse in religious contexts. Over the past couple of decades, a sizable body of research has emerged suggesting that religious participation is strongly associated with numerous health and well-being outcomes. Large, well-designed research studies have indicated that religious service attendance is associated with greater longevity, less depression, less suicide, less smoking, less substance abuse, better cancer and cardiovascular disease survival, less divorce, greater social support, greater meaning and purpose in life, greater life satisfaction, more charitable giving, more volunteering, and greater civic engagement. While some of the early studies on this topic were methodologically weak, the study and research designs have become stronger and stronger, and for many of these outcomes, the associations are now considered well established. Religious service attendance powerfully affects health and well-being. Religious communities allow people to flourish. It should be noted, of course, that the primary end of religion itself is not simply flourishing in this life, but final communion with God, or the transcendent, here and now and in the life to come. My focus in this talk, however, will be on those aspects of health and well-being that pertain to this life and how religious communities contribute to these. Given the focus of religion itself on the transcendent, it is perhaps remarkable that participation in religious communities affects so many well-being outcomes in life here and now as well. Some of my own research on the topic from Harvard's Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality and Harvard's Human Flourishing program was published in 2016 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The research used data from the Nurses' Health Study with over 70,000 participants followed over 16 years. We found that those who attended religious services regularly were 33% less likely to die over the 16 years of follow-up. We also found that those who attended religious services regularly were 27% less likely to become depressed. They were about 50% less likely to divorce, and they were 5 times less likely to commit suicide. These are large effects, and they are large effects on numerous important health and well-being outcomes. Other research that we have done has suggested that it is religious service attendance, participation in religious community, rather than private practices or self-assessed religiosity or spirituality, that most powerfully predicts health. Something about the communal religious experience seems to matter, and it is something very different from private practice. Religious identity and private spiritual practices may of course still be very important and meaningful within the context of religious life, but they do not appear to affect health and well-being as strongly. Something about that communal religious experience, about religious service attendance, is important for health, and for many other outcomes as well. Similarly, some of our other recent research indicates that a religious upbringing also profoundly affects subsequent health and well-being. Children who are brought up attending religious services are protected against what are sometimes called the big 3 dangers of adolescence: depression, substance abuse, and risky sexual behaviors. They are also more likely to subsequently be happy, to be forgiving, to have a sense of mission and purpose, and to volunteer. And our most recent study, published in the July 2020 issue of JAMA Psychiatry, indicates that religious service attendance protects against so-called deaths of despair, deaths due to suicide, drug overdose, or alcohol abuse. It reduces such deaths of despair by about 2/3 for women and 1/3 for men. Again, these are large effects and important, critical outcomes. However, it is also important to remember that these various beneficial effects are effects on average. They will not correspond to everyone's experience. The experience of those who have suffered abuse will be very different. and this is one of the many reasons that such abuse must be addressed. Taken as a whole, however, the empirical research does establish important connections between religious service attendance and health and well-being. Given the powerful effects of religious participation on health and well-being, we might wonder why these effects are present. And it is to this question that I will now turn. I will consider both what the empirical research suggests and also what faith traditions teach. If we begin with health and longevity, one explanation would be social support. And indeed, the research does indicate that social support is important. But it seems to only explain about 1/4 of the effect on longevity. Other mechanisms seem to be operative as well, and we've shown in our research that decreased depression, decreased smoking, increased optimism and hope, and greater purpose in life are all important mechanisms for improving physical health. The existing evidence does also suggest that the mechanisms may vary across outcomes. For the effect of religious service attendance on decreased depression, the mechanisms of social support, of optimism and hope, and of meaning in life might all be important. For greater life satisfaction, the social relationships that religious services provide seem to play an especially important role, perhaps accounting for nearly half of the effect. For the dramatically lower suicide rates among those attending religious services, while social support, less alcohol, and less depression may account for some of the effect, these factors are not as explanatory as might have been thought, and the moral belief that suicide is wrong, reinforced by religious teachings, is perhaps here of especially strong importance. With lower divorce rates among those attending religious services, the programs within religious communities that support families and marriages are likely important, as are the teachings on love and sacrifice, the prohibitions against infidelity and divorce, and greater levels of life satisfaction and lower depression within married life. These may all be important mechanisms. There thus appear to be many pathways from religious service attendance, from religious community to health and well-being. Another important pathway central to religion may be forgiveness. Many religious teachings promote forgiveness of others when they have wronged you. The relationship between forgiveness and health has also received considerable attention in past years in the empirical research literature, and this has suggested that forgiveness itself is closely tied to health. Forgiveness is often conceived of simply as the replacing of ill will towards the offender with goodwill. Importantly, then, forgiveness can then be distinguished from condoning the wrong action, or from reconciling, or forgetting, or forbearing, or excusing, or not demanding justice. These things are separate from forgiving. One can forgive and hope for the ultimate good of the other while still pursuing a just outcome. The existing empirical research and even randomized trials of forgiveness interventions suggests that forgiveness is itself associated with better health, certainly better mental health and possibly better physical health as well. Forgiveness, then, might be another important mechanism relating participation in religious community to health. And importantly, critically in the context of childhood sexual abuse, forgiveness, as desiring the ultimate good of the other, can take place even while pursuing justice and a just outcome for the offender. Religious teachings themselves, I think, also provide insight into why participation in religious community might shape health and well-being. Religious communities often hold members accountable to one another. I think this is a critical role that they serve. They also promote and encourage love and good deeds. They help form a community as well, wherein one person's strengths offsets another's weaknesses, and vice versa. And they allow for a common pursuit of God, of ultimate and transcendent ends. I think these all are likewise probably part of the explanation for why we see such a strong connection between participation in religious community and health and well-being. And these various connections also mean we must take seriously whatever hinders this powerful work that religious communities do in the promotion of human flourishing. We must address issues, therefore, of prevention and of healing for childhood sexual abuse. We must do so for its own sake, for the sake of the victims, and to prevent such abuse in the future. And this is paramount. We must also do so for the sake of the religious communities themselves, to allow these communities to heal, to allow victims and loved ones to potentially return, to find healing, to find flourishing and forgiveness and justice. We must do so thus also to better enable these communities to carry out their important work of promoting human flourishing, here and now and beyond. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Father Jerry McGlone. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be joining you today. As you begin or as you continue in this virtual symposium of faith and flourishing in the face of childhood sexual abuse, strategies for prevention, healing of child sexual abuse, being co-sponsored by Harvard University and Catholic University of America. As you will see here, you can have contact with me either via email, or if you went to the Berkeley Center at georgetown.edu, you will have access to my articles and chapters and presentations. Give you, first of all, access there also to a TED Talk that I recently did about my own story of being a survivor of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, and how do we sort of begin to move forward in creating a healing faith community. And that is the topic for today, moving from a perpetrating faith community to a healing faith community. I believe that it's possible, but we have to sort of challenge ourselves to get out of a mindset that simply putting a policy in place without having some sort of sense of how that policy is being implemented and indeed guarded often fails to understand or grasp the contextual or systemic realities that have created the perpetrating faith community in the first place. And I hope to explore various dynamics of that today, but I'd like to first start with this wonderful quote from one of my favorite authors, Maya Angelou. Words are things, I'm convinced. Someday we'll be able to measure the power of words. I think they are things. I think they get on the walls, they get in your wallpaper, they get in your rugs, in your upholstery, in your clothes, and finally into you. I believe words matter, and we need to measure the power of those words. Most especially, we need to put the stories of survivors first and get away from the perpetrators first perspective that has dominated the faith community's responses to the sexual abuse issues in the past 30 years. What I'd like to really detail are the dynamics and dimensions of a perpetrating faith community, the dynamics and dimensions of what a healing faith community may look like, and a possible path forward. So what are the dimensions or dynamics of a perpetrating faith community? Well, I alluded to several of them when I first began talking about the fact that if I'm solely concerned with the bad apple, with the perpetrating offender, clergy member, or priest, or brother, then I'm missing the fuller picture. Because just as our own understanding of sexual abuse and addictions has grown in these past 40 to 50 years, so too has our understanding of what does it mean for us to provide a healing, safe environment for children and for vulnerable adults in any faith community. The first understanding is to get out of the notion that it's just that bad apple, that it's somehow that person's fault, and that there wasn't also enabling of the faith community members, of the people who were trained with them, fellow clergy, and most especially the biggest sin and crime that most of the faithful point to are really the cover-up and the consistent cover-up of church leaders that allowed the perpetration to go on, enabled the perpetration to go on in the silence and secrets of the faith institution itself. If we can begin to understand the fact that the system itself, the bed barrel within which sexual offending occurred, needs to be addressed, then we might begin to see healing in a faith community itself. But the characteristics of a perpetrating faith community are seen in many different videos or many different stories of abuse that I give you as citations at the end of this particular presentation. You can see in the films of Judgment or Spotlight or Betrayal of Trust, the characters that display just this absolute horror of victimization against individual children or individual adults on a regular and consistent basis, because they had the opportunity to do that, but also because they were in an exalted role over these individuals, that the faith community thought that they were above the law in certain instances. And most especially that the church, and in particular various faith communities, protected the institution and the reputations of the institution as opposed to seeing and knowing and hearing the horror that a survivor might have experienced, and to attending to that reality instead of defensiveness, keeping secrets, instead of the secrecy associated with what it meant for this member to be transferred from parish or faith community to faith community. And most especially for the lawyers and the insurance agents, who often their sole responsibility was to protect the financial interests of the church or the financial institution of the religious order. In many different instances, what we see is a consistent pattern of putting the perpetrator first and their care first, of protecting the institution, of denying and minimizing the issue, of making sure that the secret is kept private, and above all, silencing survivors and survivors' families. With little knowledge or with little attention given to the survivor, little attention and care was given to the families of the survivors. And what we see in research across study after study is that the long-term health effects of sexual abuse are so deleterious to the individual that that actually causes a diminution in the mortality rates, so that survivors of sexual abuse die younger, either through addiction or through suicide or through health outcomes that debilitate the individual tragically. So what we see, unfortunately, is the fact that the system itself, that the perpetrating institution, faith community, becomes, in a very real sense, a source of perpetration of sexual offending because of a lack of knowledge and expertise, or even appeal to experts and expertise on a consistent basis. Church leaders hid and abetted in the sexual offending that was gone on for years and years and years. Because the perpetration was committed by a member of the faith community, there is a type of injury, a moral injury, I would contend, that becomes a sacred moral injury. In other words, we know that individuals who have access to spirituality and practice their faith live on average 7 years longer than someone who doesn't. So imagine the opposite then of when a person's been injured by a member of the faith community who represents God. Potentially that resource has been stripped away from them permanently. And so in order for healing to occur, perhaps that avenue needs to be healed, and perhaps that avenue needs to be more explicitly part of the treatment protocols and in recreating a healthy, healing faith community. And so what are the dimensions of what that might look like? Well, the first dimension there is the ability to restore hope, the ability to restore hope and the ability to heal is linked very much to what we see in the literature in regards to shalom, or creating peace. And so I love this saying of Elie Wiesel, that hope is like peace. It's not just a gift from God. It's a gift only we can give one another. That gift, I believe, is sown, seen, and absolutely appropriated in what we can call a healing faith community. It is the mirror opposite of what does it mean to be a perpetrating faith community. First of all, it's a survivors first versus a perpetrators first. Secondarily, there are measures that inhibit the sexual abuse from occurring, that detects and facilitates detection of abuse occurring, and that expedites response to sexual abuse occurring. It's listening to, acknowledging, and honoring the stories of survivors and placing them in the formation and education programs of all clergy and religious leaders. The healing of survivors then becomes the paramount focus, not protecting the institution's reputation, not protecting its resources, but putting all resources in disposal of the survivors and their needs. It is the opposite of denial. It is transparency and accountability that shows itself not only in wonderful practices and policies that are clearly necessary in order to begin creating a new culture of safeguarding, but are hardly sufficient in creating a new culture of safeguarding and protection. So what does that mean? Well, it means then that the priority is to the story, the words of the survivor, to listen to how and why and where and when that abuse took place. But most especially, it is the role of the entire community to welcome and to restore that survivor to their rightful place, if indeed they can do that at all. As I said previously, sometimes with stories of survivors that we see they want nothing to do with the faith community because they were so brutally traumatized and re-traumatized by the religious leaders or their representatives. It is therefore critically important for us to be able to be vigilant. In other words, that a policy on a board or policy in a doorway means nothing about changing the ways in which the community of faith relates one to another. So that if we have a new culture of safeguarding, then first and foremost, of course, we have policies, we have standards, but then we have ways to check compliance to those standards. We have ways in which then we're constantly vigilant about mistakes that are being made. We see this in the model of highly reliable organizations, in which there's a constant ongoing formation and a lack of complacency in regards to the issues related to safeguarding and placing the stories of survivors first. If we are indeed able to have a healing faith community, then we put aside the perpetrating ways. So that means the stories of survivors are paramount, but most especially what it means is that we're then able to heal the sacred moral injury that has occurred, giving access to various faith leaders if the person is uncomfortable with a faith leader from their own tradition in which the abuse occurred, being able to understand the sacred duty that healing is just as sacred now of that particular moral injury. In one way, if we look at healing sacred moral injury in perhaps an analogy like this, if I fall down, then oftentimes I learn that I've got to get up and that, gee, I wasn't looking or somehow the sidewalk had a crink in it. But if I fall down and I'm pushed, then I need to look at who was the perpetrator of that and how do I begin to heal that wound with that individual. But if I see that I've been pushed and then horribly traumatized by a man representing God, and oh, by the way, all the other priests and religious were watching and all the other kids simply looked away or all the other teachers looked away, then I have a perpetrating community that needs now to be attentive so that the horrible tragedy of falling, the horrible tragedy of being sexually abused, the horrible tragedy of being raped is then reported to authorities on a regular basis. If I hold myself to the standards of restoring and healing sacred moral injury, then I understand and know, most especially, that the path forward is this: that the creation of a faith community that heals doesn't just happen overnight, but begins and ends with hard work that demands vigilance. Begins and ends in the most sacred and ancient spiritual act that we know of in any faith community is a holy listening, a listening that allows a survivor to be believed, acknowledged, and heard. It shatters the silence, denial, and secrecy, begins a communal transformation, not a personal transformation, into a culture of safety and protection, and a new mission to tell the story yet again. Maya Angelou once said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." That, I believe, with these resources at your disposal, is the way in which we create a healing, dynamic, transformed faith community. Thank you for your time. Thank you for honoring me in this way.